Good. So, good evening, everyone. This evening, I'd like to share a little bit about my own birth story and how it is I came about remembering it and what it has meant for me personally, not necessarily as a therapist or as a teacher. And I'll probably share for around, I don't know, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then I'll leave the floor open to questions. And this could be the beginning of a sequence. Maybe once a month I show up and people start sharing a little bit about their stories. But this evening I would invite you to listen gently, to see what's true for you and what isn't. Not everything I speak out loud resonates necessarily, but maybe beginning to feel a language that might be associated with our birth stories and where it is you can access it within yourself. And if something is true for myself, let's say, um, it withstands the test of time. It keeps showing up. And if it keeps showing up, I pay attention. So I want to start this evening to just show you something very precious is one of the few things that I have from my childhood, and it's my baby book. And it's the baby book my mother made when I was in hospital. And it even has the little bracelet that I wore at the hospital. And so I know exactly what time I was born and all of that story. And as someone that really traveled in my life, it's something that really stayed with me and really anchors me back to myself. And that there were parents that, cared enough or anticipated enough for my arrival. My experience as a doula, as somebody that supports families prepare and give birth, the story a mother remembers of how she gave birth is not necessarily the same as the baby's experience of being born. So, as much as it's beautiful to have these books, it's often an impression of how the outside world saw us or expected of us rather than our own story. So, let's say back in 2012, 2013, so just over 10 years ago, about 12 years ago, I decided that the world of crystals and earth and energetics and meditation was becoming a little bit too dry. And I decided to return to my happy place, which was water, but to return to it professionally. Because yeah, my calling was to be where I am the happiest. And I loved seeing this, floating people. And I also noticed I was already working in a kindergarten with children and crystals, and that if you, and I had been working as a therapist for years or already on land, that everything was leading back to the very beginning. One way or another. And it seemed like the earlier I could go back, I was I could have access to the thread, let's say, to unfold it. Um, so I was fascinated by the underwater part. However, you can't take someone underwater straight away, even if you grew up I grew up on an island. My relationship with water wasn't just therapeutic, it's been my life. uh, Growing up in a family where my dad was a fisherman. So water was part of my life. And even though it seemed easy to float someone and natural, the sense of responsibility that comes with it makes it something to learn in how to hold others. So I was lucky enough to start with Arjana, who was the founder of Wata, Tansen, water dance. And Arjana and her partner, many, many years ago, I think it was late 70s, early 80s, came up with water dance while at the same time Harold Dahl was coming up with Watsu over in Harbin Hot Springs in the States. Um, so Arjana taught Watsu, and because you needed to do Watsu in order to get to the underwater part. Because Watsu level one, you float people on the surface. So um, off I went to Belgium, to Brussels, and usually training is 5 days in the water, which is quite an intense process to be in the water, you know, around 6 hours a day. Even if you love water, it's a process, and you're learning something new. And I was doing great. I was used to a degree, no, not a degree. I was used to process on land. I thought I had done quite a lot of my own work. Uh, Many, many years of family constellations. My relationship to family, to members of my family, relationship to myself, um, my dreams, my skills, my capacities. Remembering was already on the agenda, so to speak. Um, and then on the last day, it was closing. What had we learned from the week? And Ajana says, and now you're all going to stand up in the circle and you're going to imagine that you have a brand new pair of shoes. Simple visualization, nothing complicated. And I remember they were a beautiful pair of yellow sandals. I imagine sandals. And I stand up and I look down, and there's two pairs of shoes. And out of nowhere. And I couldn't, first I was surprised that there was two pairs of shoes, and I couldn't choose which pair of shoes to put my feet into. And it must have hit like a wire in my body because I just literally, um, I collapsed. I started really shaking and crying and not understanding what was happening. And the pain was, oh my God, if I take this pair, what if the other person wants this pair? I'll be taking that pair away from them. And I think that level of sort of empathy and connection with other, of some other, was not new. It was already very deep inside of me as a way of thinking that that's kind of normal behavior. And I don't think on that occasion I ever decided which pair of shoes was mine. But I was in shock because I knew that I had touched on something very deep that no matter how many years of therapy I'd done before, I hadn't come across this depth of memory or feeling. And Arjana luckily said, "Ooh, have you considered the idea that you were conceived a twin?" And no matter how many years of therapy I'd done before, it had absolutely never, ever, ever showed up, even as a suggestion or anything like that. So I was very lucky that she knew. She was a teacher. She was an informed teacher, and she knew who to send me to. because birth memories can come up in many different environments. They can come up on land, they can come up in various shamanic kind of therapies, they can come up with plant medicine, and they can come up with water. Knowing what to do with them is a whole other story. So she suggested I meet David and David Sawyer, who brought integrative aquatic therapy, so somatic psychology into water. So he wasn't so much focused, he wasn't a birth-related person, but understood that our prenatal stories were foundational in our psychology, and he had brought that psychology to the water. So his work looked very different to Watsu and water dance, which was a lot more um, aquatic bodywork, movement in the water, having a beautiful, blissful experience in which some prenatal stuff can come up, but it isn't therapy in a sort of integrated, even verbal way, in the way that it's held. And I think I think it took me about 3 months to speak about it. I was in shock. Um, Mostly, I was already around 32 years old, something like that. And how come this has never come up? Wow, what have I been doing all this time? Just because of the depth difference. And it doesn't mean that I hadn't been doing my work. Um, I didn't go looking for it. I wasn't looking for a prenatal story to show up. Um, Although I knew from experience that training in a new modality always involves personal healing. I knew that there would be a level of my own transformation. I just didn't expect this to come up. And for sure, it doesn't, just because you come to the water doesn't mean that everyone's going to start having prenatal memories. Mm. And even though there might be recognizable milestones or patterns that a prenatal story might unfold through, we we don't all remember the same things. We don't remember the same way. They're not important for us in the same way. They don't touch us. It doesn't touch us the same way. Um, However, the depth that these memories or imprints or patterns in the way they show up, but in the depth they occupy is at the core of who we are, not just psychologically, because they are the foundation stones of our personality, but also physically, because we were in formation. The flesh was being formed in utero when some of these patterns were being formed, whether they were contractions or trauma. That's a whole other learning. I don't want to go there now. Now, many people that I've met, either as clients or colleagues or friends that are pre and sort of perinatally informed, tend to come at it from a dramatic point of view, like it touches them, there is shock, or there's an illness or sickness or something that has culminated in them seeing their birth story for the first time, especially when it's not an intentional space, it just happened. If someone is going to go looking for it, it's best to do it in a space where it's held intentionally, safely, with care, because our birth stories are like newborn babies. And often they're not even born yet. That's how precious they are. That's how sensitive and delicate the stories are. And yet they very often never get heard. They live inside of us, but don't find the words to the surface. Mostly because there isn't a need, unless there's a medical need or a psychological need. No one really asks, up to a degree, but mostly it's like, yeah, you had an easy birth, everything was fine, you made it, you're alive. Be grateful, and that's enough. And that's what we know. Or if it was dramatic, we know a few more things, mainly of what we're told was true. Mm, I knew that I was going to devote myself to this work. The first 3 months, I just knew the rest of my life was going to be devoted to this work. And it took me 3 months to visit my local therapist, who's a constellator, and say, this came up. We'd already been working for, 15 years together. So to actually speak vanishing twin or birth memory, to put it on the table. And she had a little Playmobil set for constellations. And it was the first time, and I still have pictures of the constellation, that I could place the little figures in one for the twin. It was a huge process. The processes that I remember, like cornerstones of my inner development. And I think the biggest takeaways in the early days of this realization was how many emotions I was already experiencing before I was born. How I had already formed an impression of life and what's fair and what's not fair. Even God, uh, and what I meant to do this alone. Very mixed, very mixed feelings. Um, it put a lot of my relationship with my family in perspective. Like, it wasn't my mom's fault or my dad's, it wasn't anyone's fault. It's kind of things that happen in the first 9 months, and life happens. And nature has a way of selecting. There's a selection process of strong embryos or not strong embryos, that when you live in a village and there's 50 cats in the neighborhood, you see like the selection process is a lot simpler, of which kittens make it and which don't. But the depths of feelings like grief and guilt, mm, I think has taken me, the past 10, 12 years to really come to be at peace with it. And to not live by that, not to be defined by the story, so to speak. Like, I am that story. It's at the core of who I am, but I am also. And one of the things that made sense is that I always worked double, at least double. I worked for two. And sometimes I was aligned with things that weren't necessarily mine. And it was like, who am I doing this for? And then I learned over time to kind of, okay, stay, stay on my lane. And I remember already as a teenager, 14, 15. I mean, it's a weird time anyway, being a teenager, right? But I remember particularly kind of looking in the mirror and kind of saying, who are you? Like, my consciousness does not belong in this body. Like, what am I doing here? There was a very weird feeling about being on earth and being in this life and really not wanting to be here, quite honestly. Um, and since I started processing my birth story, I realized it is about the more I remembered, the more it was about being here with a full yes, like being fully alive. Like this life is so precious, and I made it, and I came, and choices were made. Let me give it all I'm worth. And to speak this reality out loud with every opportunity, because it might be of service to someone else. And the more IVF babies are born, because IVF is creating multiple fertilizations in one go. And even staff that works medically around birth, like midwives and obstetricians, have little understanding or embodied understanding of prenatal psychology and the impact this has on the surviving twin. And there were a few books starting to surface in the kind of 70s and 80s of surviving twins starting to write books. Like there was something that nobody recognized. There wasn't really, I mean, ultrasound was invented around 74. I mean, I was born in 74. So before 74, there was no ultrasound. Or there might be blood loss, or there might be, in very early stages, but one twin made it. So there was no need to kind of focus on the fact that, maybe there was a loss because you had a baby, right? And I've also heard of practices where during birth a baby is born and maybe there's a sign of an absorbed twin. It's called a parched twin. And doctors or nurses or midwives don't tell. It's like, okay, why bother telling them? Everything's fine, baby's born, why tell them? So they kind of remove it silently. But I'm here to speak of the huge implications of knowing there is a reality you've experienced and it touches you deeply, it makes sense to who you are, that the world is not aware of. And to arrive in oneself, to be able to say, yeah, this is my reality, whether it makes sense to you or not. And I accept myself and my story for who I am, has given me a whole other understanding of strength. It's not confidence even, but it's just an authority that you can only give yourself. And that I'm not mad, I'm not crazy. There's other people, and luckily David and the Water family, we were like 20, 30 students moving through the training together over 10 years. And people were having similar experiences. And when we speak the same language, we can start having compassion for one another. And then we start to feel, I am seen. Now you see me. Now you hear me. Now you feel me. And finally, there was a sense of, okay, I make sense to this in this world. And I know many, many people that have this feeling that their families don't get them, society doesn't get, but who gets me finally, in inverted commas? And it's not until the birth story is seen, heard, witnessed, and brought to the light that the core of who we are can show up. And because we're living at a time where our strength and our potency and the reason why we came is really at the forefront, it is really, I think we're being called to lead from that place inside of us. It's also rooting on earth and saying, yes, I'm here, when we access that part of us. And finally, we can feel we've arrived. Yes, we're born. Yes, all the organs function okay. And yet, so at the beginning, it can feel a little bit not lonely, but private, like it's only I can really hold this for myself. And it can be difficult because you want to share it with your loved one or someone. If it's your twin, someone must understand, but not everyone does. And especially in a realm where most of the communication is nonverbal. So I think up until the age of 12, I thought most people were telepathic. I didn't speak much, thinking that everyone could really understand that, but you get it, right? And then I would realize I didn't get it. And over time, I realized, oh, we're not all seeing the same picture. I need to learn how to speak this to bring it up here onto Earth side and to give it existence and form. Yeah, and to be taken seriously. And this last year, I organized the first pre and perinatal aquatic symposium, because there's another dimension to this work when you bring it in the water, because it simulates a womb-like environment, which is different to when you do the processes on land, also very deep, also very deep. And this year, the symposium is going to happen online before we meet again in person. And this year, the theme is creating safe containers. So there are certain parameters, because once we start entering the prenatal field, we're so sensitive and vulnerable and impressionable to new ideas and programs. We really need to hold these spaces with reverence, because they are so formative. This won't be until May. And so what I would say, closing, I think for now, accessing prenatal memories for me is not something that we induce in the same way that we wouldn't induce a birth. It's not about holotropic breathing or kind of inducing a kind of breath or an altered state in order to access part of the brain. Water for me is a natural catalyst, which is the same as the environment in which the memory was formed. And you've heard of the term déjà vu, and déjà vu often happens when there are similar circumstances like smell, temperature, colors, pictures that can take us to a certain place. And once we are in water, the way we hold the process, of course, impacts the field and how the story unfolds. So we can learn a lot through books. We can be doctors of birth stories. But for me, there's no greater teacher than our own story itself. Like the thread that unfolds my own story is the deepest teacher because it's in me and no one else can do the unraveling. And at the beginning, we can get excited, like, okay, unravel some more, unravel some more. And I would say, unfold it. It will always keep unfolding somehow, and it will always keep calling you back. But I wouldn't push it if there is no need. My camera is doing very weird things. And remember that you're bringing your story into any field, whether it's giving birth, whether it's holding other people in their stories, and to what degree my story is coloring my perception of reality and someone else's story. It's, let's say, the deeper we go into the stories, the more it is important to stay in our own lane, in our own timeline, and to ask questions because we might feel certain things but never make assumptions because what's true for us might not be true for the other person in that moment in time. And again, it is such an impressionable field. When we were doing our training with David, we would always use spaces with there were no pictures on the wall. There was no religious or spiritual icons or anything that could already form an impression onto our process. And especially, the first words someone spoke to us, or the first eye contact we had with someone, or the first meal we might eat after a powerful process. And then you learn to respect yourself completely differently. I think that's one of the biggest results of integrating our stories. We become a lot bigger in how we hold ourselves. There's quite a lot of books. I will just share two or three just to see if, it's something that you want to, but not necessarily. But the most kind of well-known is Cosmic Cradle, Carmen and Carmen. This is stories of children that started to talk of something else. Some stories resonate, other stories don't. And this is mostly parents that took their children seriously enough to kind of listen and to not say, oh, don't be ridiculous or don't be so silly. I would say, tell me more. Tell me more. At the same time, I've seen parents that, use their kids a little bit like guinea pigs, if I'm allowed to say that. Like knowing also when to respect a child's psychic space by not forcing it to, sometimes a child will say things to make us happy, looking for the right kind of answers. Um, and there's a lot that gets spoken during play. So observing a child, how a child plays, or how a child shows up in the water, which is what I specialized in, reveals certain things. And then definitely Cheriona mensam sils. So she's written the prenatal shadow and spirit into form. Yep. Cheriona. I mean, I can take a picture of, send you these big books. So, and then Austerman and Austerman wrote Drama in the Womb, the surviving twin syndrome. The reason I kept this book out, they're looking at it more from the drama point of view, obviously. They have a pool in Berlin, which is the pool I used to use for the training, which is Ruth, you came to that pool. Um, I think what I'm arriving at in myself is how to hold the birth stories with magic, because there's so much magic around, it's connected to the magical child, the spirit child, the one that, we are, that is, it's pure, there's a purity there, there's an innocence connected to that part of us. And it's the part that somehow vibrates the strongest. And when we learn to access that in ourselves and we speak to the other in that space, it's not we're giving the other the benefit of the doubt, but I have found even in the most difficult situations or the most complicated people, when you speak to that part of them, you get a different person talking back. So those are some pretty good reasons for talking about birth stories. And slowly, slowly beginning to talk about our stories and owning them and integrating them in our lives. And it can be a beautiful creative space. It doesn't need to be heavy and dramatic. And to really recognize that if there are emotions or patterns or behaviors that are from that time, to eventually accept them for what they are, to come with acceptance and the compassionate witness towards ourselves. It's like accepting that, yeah, finally I was born in a physical body, life happened, and that's it. I don't know if there is such a thing as, after 15 years of trying to create the perfect, impeccable safe space, life happens. And there is a very matter-of-factness about it, beyond any meaning or interpretation that we might give it. And I believe that as parents, we do our best to, protect our kids from the part of life that isn't sparkly and feels good. And we're not always given the tools to sit with the uncomfortable parts, and they're also there. So yeah, I would love these spaces to feel user-friendly, that we don't feel scared to enter prenatal spaces as if, there's something lurking in the darkness that's going to come out and get us. Yeah. Thank you for your deep ears. It's, yeah, I'm very grateful to be sharing like this. Easy, sharing a story that I know very well, and every time I tell it, something new comes up. So I don't know, over to you a little bit. Like, do you have any question? It can be a question, or it can be, I heard this. Like, what touched you that maybe you hadn't thought about before, or about your story? Does that feel safe enough to do? What I might do is I'll close the recording. Thank you for listening, so that any sharing then happens without cameras. Thank you.